Hi everyone. In this video I'd like to take a look at some of the fundamental assumptions of postcolonial theory, which took shape in the late 20th century and which has profoundly influenced the practice of art history, as well as other fields. The term postcolonial can be understood in a couple of basic ways. Perhaps most obviously, it alludes to the period that followed the collapse of the major European colonial powers, Spain, Britain, and France, in the 1800s and early 1900s, and the resulting political independence of numerous former colonies. But the term can also be seen as part of an attempt to transcend or move beyond colonial modes of thought, and to practice a form of analysis that embraces multiplicity, complexity, and exchange, rather than one that assumes the dominance and the centrality of the European tradition. In any case, where Marxist analysis insists that we take class difference into account, and feminist analysis emphasizes the importance of categories related to sex and gender, post-colonial analysis foregrounds race, ethnicity, and relations between cultures. Now, a number of writers played a role in the development of post-colonial theory, but perhaps the most widely read work is Orientalism, published by the Palestinian scholar Edward Said in 1978. In focusing primarily on European colonialist discourse in the 1700s and 1800s, Said offered a compelling argument that the West essentially invented what it called the Orient, a realm that was broadly understood to encompass northern Africa and the Middle East, and that the West habitually portrayed as exotic, sensuous, and trapped in a pre-modern past. None of this, Said pointed out, was necessarily accurate or rooted in close observation. Rather, it was a convenient fiction developed by the colonial powers as a way of privileging their own cultural traditions, which were characterized by contrast as rational, industrious, and modern. The result, then, was a binary view of the world that served as a convenient justification for the colonial project, as Europe could defend its political subjugation of the Orient as a process of modernization. Said's book was massively influential. To be fair, there have been some criticisms offered over the years. Said's central binary between East and West, for example, is sometimes seen as oversimplistic, and some scholars have pointed out that Europeans never saw the supposed Orient in purely negative terms. In fact, Europeans often enjoyed traveling to non-Western realms, and routinely sought spiritual or personal renewal through contact with a variety of traditions. But despite such critiques, the potential value of Said's ideas as an analytic lens was clear, and soon art historians began to explore and to apply his approach to their own field. In 1983, the art historian Linda Nochlin wrote a powerful essay in response to an exhibition of Orientalist paintings, that is, paintings made by Europeans in the 1800s that represented colonial subjects. Nochlin contended that these paintings repeatedly represented the so-called Orient as a pre-modern realm in which there was no sign of modern technologies or of Western presence. Moreover, the figures in the paintings were often slothful or lazy, slumped against walls. They seemed incapable of meaningful work, and repeated visual signs, such as the chipped tiles visible in the background of this painting, implied that they were incapable of maintaining their own cultural traditions. Sure, the Orient was a colorful and exotic place, as Chahom's rendering of the snake charmer implies, but it was also, as represented in Orientalist painting, an implicitly medieval world that needed the help of allegedly civilized, modern European powers. In Nochlin's view, then, Orientalist paintings were a form of self-serving propaganda that allowed Western viewers to feel morally superior to a fictive East, even as they vicariously enjoyed the eroticism that was frequently on display in such works. Nochlin's application of Said's logic to Orientalist paintings was powerful, but at the same time other theorists were developing still other models and ideas. This 1989 book, for example, focused largely on the notions of center and periphery. According to the logic of the colonial powers, the relationship between the metropole, Paris or London, say, and the colonies was relatively simple. Raw materials and resources flowed from the colonies to the capital, which in turn exported cultural ideas and political influence. In reality, though, this relationship was considerably more complicated, and it's rather easy to locate instances in which the colonies profoundly influenced European practices. Just think of tea, that popular South Asian export that fundamentally reshaped British life. Or consider Picasso's infamous 1907 painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which has long been seen as a touchstone of European modernism, but whose forms are partially derived from Picasso's study of West African masks in an ethnological museum in Paris. Clearly, then, lines of influence could be complex, and colonial practices could influence the colonizer, rather than the other way around. And such interchanges could result in entirely new forms or possibilities. In his writings, the Indian scholar Hamike Bhabha emphasized the concept of hybridity, that is, the idea that contacts between cultures could yield novel combinations. The personalized coffins produced by some Ghanaian woodcarvers offer one example here, as Western commodities, a Coca-Cola bottle here, are converted into funerary works that recall the careers or the tastes of African individuals to be buried inside them. But art historians have also used the notion of hybridity as a way of resituating the work of Jackson Pollock, an abstract expressionist painter famous for the massive drip paintings he executed in the 1940s and 1950s. Traditionally, these were often cited as a classic expression of New York modernism, but it's valuable to realize that as a young man, Pollock traveled extensively in the American Southwest and saw the work of both Navajo sand painters, who drizzled color onto a flat surface, and Mexican muralists, who worked on a bold scale that clearly affected Pollock. Pollock wasn't working in a vacuum, in other words. Rather, his practice can usefully be seen as a hybrid result of productive interactions between different cultural traditions. Even so, it's worth remembering that colonial power was oppressive, and that the colonized were often stripped of their individual or their artistic agency. Gayatri Spivak popularized the term subaltern, which basically means subordinate, as a means of discussing those whose voices were effectively marginalized by colonial institutions, such as the church or the government. Recovering the voice of the subaltern, which was often not reflected in official documents, can be quite challenging, but it's been a central goal of many postcolonial historians. And in some cases, we can even begin to speak meaningfully about local resistance to colonial regimes, whether it's through subtle acts of what's called abrogation, that is, a willful misuse of colonial machinery or language, or open revolution. In any event, as Michael Hatt and Charlotte Klonk have put it, postcolonial theory asks this: what would history look like if it were written from the point of view of the periphery? Finally, it's worth noting that there have also been repeated calls in recent years for a thorough decolonization of art history and of the academy more generally. These calls have assumed various forms, and the term decolonization is often used in diverse ways. There's no simple agreement about what it might entail. As Kamini Volodius pointed out, though, it can't simply mean a diversification of content. Rather, we also need to address the very forms that art historical thought has traditionally taken, and to consider including other ways of knowing and learning, such as orality or embodiedness, in addition to the traditional emphasis on the written word. Regardless of the specifics, though, postcolonial theory has made a compelling case that traditional art historical narratives have too often assumed a white and a Western perspective, and that a closer and more thoughtful attention to specific cultural differences is not only desirable, but necessary.